Hey, y'all, welcome back. This is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Pete about our film Christspiracy, also known as What Would Jesus Do, and his book, The Athos Diet, about the monks and their abstinence from animal flesh at Mount Athos. If you haven't seen part 1, go check that out first, but the same disclaimer applies here. This was recorded last year under, let's say, some very sleepy circumstances when I was a new father and wasn't able to put the episode out. But the conversation speaks for itself, and given the recent confusion around our film's position brought up in the Jubilee debate, I think it's more relevant to release now than ever. I hope you enjoy.
So, hey, I'm Dr. Pete Petitsis, ER Doc, checking in and speaking with Cameron Waters. Very interesting, very interesting film called The Christspiracy, which we want to talk to today. And I think what we'll find as we explore this film is that there's some really interesting. The film itself stands on its own, but there's some very interesting overlap in terms of the efforts of my paradigm with the Athos diet and the benefits of fasting and consuming a plant-based diet, and then of course the overlap with Christspiracy, where we might look at our the creatures of this world in a slightly different light. And I really enjoyed watching the film. I have a million questions for you about it, and as I say, I think we'll have a very organic discussion about how our common interests sort of overlap in many ways by just exploring the film that you put together, which was really phenomenal. What month did that come out, by the way, Cameron?
So we released worldwide in theaters in March, right around Easter, and
Okay.
we actually released on Palm Sunday of 2024. And then we went digital on our own platform that we built at Christspiracy.com in November of last year. And now, as we speak, we're actually about to launch another theater run in Italy
Hmm.
specifically. And we've got all kinds of advertisements and people doing stuff around the Vatican and all this
Hmm.
stuff. Rome is already sold out. Milan is about to be sold out. It might already be sold out, but it's all over. Those are the major cities, but all the cities in Italy for the whole month are going to be doing screenings in theaters there.
Sort of a 30,000 foot view, but I think what's so interesting about the way that you're promoting the film is it almost seems like a nonprofit movement. Like as
Yeah.
if someone had discovered the cure for cancer and is saying, you know what, we want to share this with the world. And I I just wanted to know if that's accurate or not, because it really seems like I don't know if ideology is the right word, but you really have a paradigm for life. I think that you're promoting rather than just simply trying to market a good documentary.
Absolutely. Yeah, we always say it's more than a movie, it's a movement. We want to see it spark a conversation that goes even beyond the movie itself. But in terms of your comment about it being almost like a nonprofit movement,
Yeah.
it really actually is, because the production company that my co-director Kip started, who created also Cowspiracy, What the Hell, Seaspiracy, these previous films, it is a nonprofit. And we, got a Netflix deal early on when we started making this film together, and we can get into the backstory of all of that and whatnot. It's a fun story, but
I
the
heard you denied him like a Harvard dropout, like that goes on to start $1 billion company. It's sort of like not good enough for me. I don't know what was the rationale of that. That sounds pretty tempting.
Well, yeah. So we had just started, discussions, really, Kip and I, around the film, around the topic. I had already done quite a lot of research on the Christian angle of this, and a little bit of the other material in the film as well, but specifically the Christ story, the temple cleanse, all of these things that we'll discuss. But when I went to him, he, because of his previous success with his other films, which were all just licensed by Netflix up to that point,
Okay.
Netflix came to him and said, "Hey, what are you working on right now?" And he mentioned our film, which at the time was loosely entitled Cow Spiritual, as a play on Cowspiracy, the first film.
I see. I see.
And then also Seaspiracy was in the works, which was a film that came out a little bit before ours as a Netflix original. So both Christspiracy and Seaspiracy were were a Netflix original deal from the gate. So
Hmm.
then once we got into the filming, deeper research, putting the film together, and then eventually, right around the time of COVID, presenting Netflix with our first edit, that was when things got a little bit weird. And Netflix felt that there were aspects of the film that they wanted to fully cleanly edit out some
Hmm.
other ways they wanted to change some of the storytelling and some things that we just felt weren't really authentic to what we were actually doing and creating at the time. And we inherently, being a little bit contrarian and just also wanting to stay true to the story, we in a way almost went even harder in the direction that we were going. And we just eventually saw that we really couldn't see eye to eye with Netflix. And, you know, it was an amicable split for the most part. I think they had respect that we wanted to keep it authentic, but we had to make the bold decision, really. Like, do we want to go with the streamer, get all the guaranteed viewers and subscribers that they have and everything, but sacrifice important aspects of this story, or do we want to keep it true? And we decided to buy our film back. And at the time when we stepped back, we didn't even have the funds. You know, like I said, it is a nonprofit venture. We didn't
Hmm.
even really have the capacity to do that at the time. So it really took about 2 years for us to develop a plan, utilizing crowdfunding to, you know, get the support of community and people that believed in the message or wanted to see what we had to bring to the table and heard our story to help us support in buying the film back. And then since then, why you see this that you're describing as like this nonprofit movement and the way that we're marketing and everything is really because it's crowd backed, because we were able to get our rights back only with the support of our fans. And now, having it on our own platform, we just decided to release it completely for free, basically, with the option to pay it forward, so that we can, you know, continue to just utilize any pay it forward donations and anything that we get to further market the film and just get the message out there. But the goal, it's not your traditional film, and that we have this like over under kind of metric that we're trying to meet, you know, to make a certain amount of money or something like that. It's just about literally how many people can we get to see this film, and what tools and resources do we have to put it out there. So we had some, you know, we were able to get this theatrical deal, with this company that was able to push it out as an event cinema. It was 2 days back in March of last year. Then we built our platform to release it freely digitally. But even since then, we had someone from Italy say, "Hey, I have a connect to be able to get this into Italian theaters. Can we do that?" And so we're open, you know, to just anybody who comes with ideas to just push it out there to more and more people to hear the story and hear the message.
Well, it's certainly very thought provoking, and I do think that it's interesting because it does delve into this very sensitive topic of food. I mean, when you really think about it, if
Yeah,
you want to piss off a room, go tell them that the McDonald's that they're eating is bad, that they've been enjoying every day of their life. I mean, it's kind of like that sort of a drop the mics moment
right,
for society. Uh, and at the same time, you know, I know myself, being a Greek Orthodox Christian and someone who believes in fasting, has been doing it since a very young age, about the age of 7. Um, there's something very strongly. Well, let me put it this way: food is a very important aspect of our culture,
right,
and you might as well say like, my skin's the wrong color. You know, when you're saying, "Hey, you're eating the wrong food." I mean, it feels
right,
that personal. And as a
right,
medical doctor, I try to I try to delve into why anatomically, physiologically, food is so core to us, and we could talk a little bit about that. But
right,
it's no surprise to me that a topic that seemingly is like, oh, this is just about, you know, food palette, you know, in some ways really rips off the band-aid of something far deeper and far more personal. Who knew it would be so controversial? Um,
yeah,
you know, I thought this was very interesting about the film, and you tell me if I'm following the trajectory of it correctly. But you interview a lot of different people across the world from different cultural beliefs, religious beliefs. Specifically, I remember you interviewing some people that are Buddhist, and if I followed correctly, it turns out that a lot of those people that follow Buddhism and are believe that literally the animals that they consume are reincarnated beings, that they in some circumstances just kind of like move, you know, give a blind eye and just eat anyway. Is that
right.
correct?
Yeah, that was one of the most surprising things for me on the journey of making the film, is because, you know, to your point about this being controversial, it is greatly centered around what we consume. It's also in a way bigger than that, but that's the core, you know, part of the argument of Christspiracy is when we consume other living beings, what are the ethical implications to that? Is there a right way, a better way to do that? What do our spiritual traditions, religious traditions have to say about that? And me coming from, a Christ following background, that was my driving force. If you watch the film, you'll see my backstory is that I come deep in the church. Had a career in gospel music, and since I was 17 years old, have just been super devout to my faith and the scripture and everything. But this question came up for me through fasting, funny enough, and we can get into that. But because of this question, I was driven into really seeing and experiencing some rub, if you will, kind of what you were alluding to. That I always like to say that the age old saying is, when you're at the dinner table or whatever, you shouldn't talk about what is, I think it's like sex, drugs, or I'm sorry, politics, sex, and something else. I can't remember. There's like the three taboo topics.
Religion, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, religion. That's right. But we're talking about religion and literally the food on the table itself. And we know now, with the diet wars and everything that's gone over the last number of years, that this could be one of the most controversial topics, because it's putting all these kind of pieces together. And so I knew going into it that maybe there would be some rub or some controversy, specifically talking about this through the Christian lens and really trying to understand what the truth is there. But I didn't expect there would be so much controversy with the more like Eastern religions, and going into it, I just wanted to know the truth about my own faith. But because I met Kip, my co-director, he comes more from like an Eastern mysticism background. He wasn't really raised in the church or anything like that. So he's always been a bit of a spiritual seeker. So he really wanted to know, what was the deal, from an Eastern sense. So then when we talked to these Buddhists and everything, I just had my jaw on the floor, because I thought for sure, oh, they have these really well-known principles about, ahimsa and, no harm at all to any sentient being. And I kind of assumed, based off of knowing India and Hinduism and also Buddhist monks, like, oh yeah, they probably just, most of them probably don't even eat animals. And lo and behold, we went on a journey trying to find a Buddhist monk who would answer, what with this kind of first tenet of not killing any sentient being, how do you reconcile that with consuming sentient beings? And we thought we were going to get a straightforward answer, and we never did. We probably got the least straightforward answer of anyone that we talked
Yeah.
to. And then finally we find these guys that you see in the film that are essentially saying what you're saying. They're like, oh yeah, well, they're essentially our reincarnated parents, possibly from our faith. Like they could even be that, but they're willing to find all these loopholes within their
Right.
framework of their
A buffet.
religion.
Was the one response something about a buffet? If it's already like prepared in buffet style, that's okay.
Right. So they really kind of their loophole, and I'm not saying this is all Buddhist by any means. I'm just saying the ones that we interviewed, we
Yeah,
kept trying to
yeah.
ask
I
around,
understand.
and the
Random
ones that we
sample.
found, they have this loophole where, as long as you aren't killing the animal yourself,
Mhm.
then it's totally the ethical implications are devoid. So it's more about the ethical implications of the person who's serving you food, if you're being served, how you treat them. And so if someone's serving you a killed animal, or and even despite of maybe how it's killed, maybe it's factory farm, maybe it's not, it doesn't even matter. It's just you're being served that food. So just eat it. It's all good. But then, like you said, we went on to ask them, okay, well, what if you're at a buffet? Because that's kind of like, you can still, it's the food that's there, but you get to make the choice. There's no host involved that's like expecting you to
Mhm.
be thankful for their provision or whatever.
Right.
What if you can make the choice? And then there was still some rub of like not being able to answer that question. And I don't want to give away in the film, but basically one of the Buddhists even kind of lied to us because he had, there was a buffet that was that morning before our interview, and we actually caught or saw him, choosing to eat all the animal products on the buffet, yet he professes that he doesn't eat animal products. So there's just a lot of yeah, we just wanted to find the truth. We weren't trying to gotcha anyone or
Yeah.
anything. It's just how it kind of fell into place.
Well, I mean, to some extent, you're touching on the ironies and inconsistencies and hypocrisy of human nature in the first place,
Right.
which I'm sure is a universal. But to that point, talking about how food unexpectedly can be so personal. My argument from a medical perspective would be something like this. Our enteric nervous system lines our gut, and there's like 30 feet of it. There's 100 million neurons involved in that process. There's 100 trillion bacteria that live in your intestine. And 80%, and this is just one of the highlights, but 80% of our serotonin that we use in our brain for all the cognitive work that we do is produced by bacteria and that interrelationship, that interplay in the intestine. So, what I mean to say is there's some brain power in your gut,
Hmm.
literally neurons. And thinking that everything is just like the center of ourselves is that it's all in our brains, it's all cerebral, is really missing the point that there's a lot of
Right.
brain power, let's say, in our gut itself. So when people talk about hunger and they talk about food preferences and that cultural aspect, you're really touching on a button that's very core to who they are. In
Right.
fact, I would argue that people are different heights, people are different IQs, some are beautiful, some are not so beautiful, but everyone gets hungry every 24 hours. That's a
Right.
very visceral experience. And there's nothing more insulting, as you mentioned, right? Walking into someone's house and being like, oh, that doesn't taste good. Oh, well, my grandma made it or my mother made it. What are you talking about? And so there's something societal there that echoes the physiology, that there's something very core. So it's interesting to me that you're able to touch on so many religious, cultural, maybe even political aspects of who we are by nature of investigating something like food and specifically meat. But yeah, I just thought that was a nice sort of echo of something that I've noticed as to why I argue something like fasting is so powerful, because it's so core to who we are, because we're interplaying with that enteric nervous system, that digestive system. And I think your film, really highlights that interplay, socially, culturally, religiously.
Yeah, I agree. And I know you hold some really interesting perspectives around this as well, that our tradition, as Christ followers, we have in the Garden of Eden, the first cardinal sin basically being the consumption of a food. It's tied
Yes.
to that. And the way our gut has such a it's the only ritual that anyone, even if you're secular or whatever, it's a ritual that everyone has, and
Mhm.
oftentimes 3 times a day, unless you're fasting or intermittent fasting or
Right,
whatever.
right.
But most people typically have like 3 times a day this ritual where they come before this thing, and it's a practice, and you get tied to it. And like you said, you have all of this interplay with the gut and the mind, and
Mhm.
culture, tradition, so many things about our identity that root in, to what we consume. So that's really what drove me to the early stages of research for this film, and then eventually making this film, is that my heritage and my ethical framework as a Christ follower growing up, literally since I was a kid, wearing "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets, like all the young Christians that
Sure,
I
sure.
grew up around did. I actually had my own Bible study called "What Would Jesus Do" when I was like 8 years old on my
Mm.
playground at school, where we would ask, my friends and I, we would hang out and we would ask like these questions. So we had a little binder from some printout from some church website or something, where it's like, if you found a wallet on the playground and you didn't know where the owner was, what would Jesus do? Would he keep the wallet for himself? Would he turn it into the teacher? Yada, yada, yada. And we would learn ethical principles and how to make through that
Mm.
question. So the rubber really met the road for me after I did a Daniel fast, which I'd love to discuss as well, because that's like, I grew up Protestant. I didn't grow up Orthodox. So we didn't have a fasting tradition growing up. But I found that at 17 years old, because the Daniel fast became this cultural movement within Protestantism in a way, because of Rick Warren, who wrote A Purpose Driven Life. He really
Mhm.
blew it up with his Daniel plan, a way really in a lot of ways to just get his church healthy, by, nature of fasting, but also drawing closer to God in the process and everything. But I started doing that at 17 years old with my family, and the practice of fasting and what it brought into my life just opened up so many doors and questions, and really for the first time made me think about what I was eating, because I
Mhm.
never really thought about it up to that point. The only other thing I had ever considered before then that I remember was I made the conscious choice at around 14 or 15 years old to stop drinking soft drinks because I actually started going out on, movie trips with my friends and whatnot. And my mom made me use my own allowance to pay for those outings. And I started noticing how much extra it was to get a soft drink at a meal. And I was like, okay, I don't want to pay that extra money. But then it made me think. I would drink water and I'd be like, man, I kind of feel better from just drinking water. And that soft drink
Funny.
probably isn't healthy. So I kind of had it in the back of my mind. But the ethical implications, and specifically this conversation around flesh consumption, these kinds of things, was just never in my mind. I was a fisherman. I was a hunter my whole life. And I even worked at a barbecue restaurant at that
I
time.
heard
So
you make a killer barbecue. I heard
yeah,
you make a killer
yeah.
barbecue. Yeah.
So it wasn't on my mind, but the fasting put it on my mind. And then it led me to this kind of what would Jesus do question. Like, what would Jesus do, in ancient times, but if anything today, because it's most applicable to me, about the food systems and what's available, what's the most ethical choice? So that really started the conversation of Christspiracy for me.
I'm paraphrasing, but I think it was an ancient father of the church that said that we broke the fast, so we were thrown out of paradise. Let us fast to return to it. And
Wow.
as was mentioned before, this first trial between Adam and Eve was one of fasting. Do not eat something, and it wasn't a edict or command on don't murder or don't. I'm sure there were a lot of. I don't think there was much of that going on, but
Mhm.
it wasn't explicitly don't say certain words, don't have sex, don't look at something. It was don't eat of something. And again, I think it speaks back to that idea that there's something very core to us, in our gut, that really is a proxy for everything else. Like in some ways, you might even say like, oh well, God, this random sample of a fasting rule. Why would that be enough to kick us out of paradise? But it is because of this anatomy, this physiology, and the way that the world sort of also orbits around that center. And so it's by no coincidence that God would pick something so core to us as a proxy for all manner of sin. And of course, we see all manner of problems after that.
Mhm.
Um, but I wanted to emphasize this point, and again, to those not familiar with my background, I'm a Greek Orthodox Christian. I'm an doc, but I thought this was very interesting. You went and talked to people in Buddhism who have, in a certain sense, placed this concept of reincarnation and not killing anything that's sentient at sort of the pinnacle high of what they represent. And what I find ironic is that if I found Greek Orthodox monks throughout the world and asked them what is their highest tenet, what is their highest good, they wouldn't say that they don't want to eat animals or that they're not willing to kill an animal. But as a result of the way they order their life, that God is at the top of this pyramid or tree or however you want to put it, um, that then they try to attain theosis. They try to live like Christ. That they try to be kind to their neighbor and have forgiveness and many of these different tenets. They don't eat meat, so
Yeah.
it's an eventual that isn't the highest. But I would tell you that I believe 99% of Orthodox monks in the world don't eat meat ever. In
Right.
fact, that's one of the canons of the church is that if you're in the Orthodox world, there are priests that often are married, pretty much 99% of the time in the world, and then there are monks, monastics who go into monasteries and communities that can be both male and female. But one of the major things they don't ever do again once they enter the monastery, which is supposed to mimic the life of Christ, is eat meat.
Right.
And so it's a funny thing to me that in some way, I would argue that if you have your life in the right orientation and sequence, a natural second, third, fourth order effect of that is actually maybe doing the primary tenet of what Buddhism isn't doing very well.
Right.
And it's just kind of like a side effect. But by all means, it's very interesting that these monastic traditions really don't want their clergy or their nuns and monks to ever eat meat again.
Right.
They eat dairy, they eat eggs, they will
Right.
eat fish, but they will not eat meat, and they're not supposed to kill animals either. It's against the canons.
Well, yeah, and my thought on that is, I'm not as familiar with Buddhism, obviously, as I am Christianity. And I know that they have all kinds of, varying beliefs and things that are, I guess we would call it theology or something that they have. But the Buddhist precepts are essentially the don't do's, right? And in the tradition of, say, like the Vedas or the yamas, for the yoga yamas, they have the don't do's to others as well. And like you said, these are more, to my understanding, a reaction to human nature when it's devolving, basically, is like, hey, well, let's draw a line here. Like, these are the bottom line baseline principles, and we have to kind of put guardrails, like, don't do this, because that's gonna lead you down an even further path. So I don't know how much of it actually is the pinnacle any more than, say, the 10 commandments have some of the don't do's in there as well as guardrails. But this is after humanity's already gone astray, and there needs to be this kind of new covenant understanding of how we can, like, be guided back into the ideal. But to your point, I totally agree with that orientation, and I think that we see it, in Genesis. You mentioned the fasting aspect with the don't eat the fruit, but even before that, really, I like to call it sometimes our forgotten first command, or the lost first command from God, is really the dominion command, right? That we're in Genesis 1:26, man is given dominion over the earth and over all the animals of the earth. And specifically, it's laid out in 126 through 128 of Genesis. But right there in 129, right after dominion's given, we have the verse that says that man's given all the herbs of the field and the fruits of the trees and everything for food. So clearly, in that Genesis dominion, that first command, it's not, that dominion doesn't include killing and harming and consuming those animals. It's actually more of a stewardship kind of command. And there's a lot of different conversation that has come through from, like you said, the patristics have talked about the stewardship ideal. It's even still discussed today, like in Catholic circles, like the Laudate Si, I believe, is the document that one of the last popes just wrote about all of that. But the bottom line is when you look at that word dominion in the Hebrew, in the original Hebrew, uh, it's been believed, for a long time, that it comes from this word radah, which means to subjugate, to press down, to rule over, kind of a domination effect, almost like a conquering king would have over a new territory or people or something like that. But the reality is that word radah, the Hebrew letters don't actually match as a root. And there's some really cool rabbinical commentary that link the true root of the word dominion to the word yarad, because it's the three exact root letters of that Hebrew word translated as dominion. And that word yarad actually means to lower oneself in service to serve others, like a servant leadership, which I believe actually better matches the nature of Christ. And the idea is that animals, the garden, the plants, the earth, it's, as humans at this kind of apex orientation that you're talking about, that proper orientation is, we're servants on the earth, to lead, to
A
guide, to
steward.
represent,
A steward.
stewards,
Yes.
to figure out ways that we can produce more food in an even more beautiful manner, to guide and make sure all the beings around us have food. There's a really powerful story, speaking of the monks, Saint Paisios. I heard it. I don't know if this is true, so
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you're fact checking me, but it's a
Tell me.
story. It's a story I heard, that he was being visited by some travelers, and he had these little, like, fruit snacks, and he was giving them to the travelers, and they
Yeah,
were
Lukumi. That's what they give
lakumi.
them on Athos. Yeah, Lukumi. Yeah, yeah.
So the story. So basically the ants started eating the lakumi, but then Saint Paisios took a piece of the lakumi and put it over to the side and told the ants, "Hey, that's yours. Go eat that," so that they would go off and leave the box of lakumi for them to eat. So there's this idea of, like, hey, let's serve these beings that God created for the order in which that he created them on the planet, make sure they have what they need, and then we also get what we need too. I think that's such a great representation. And it's quite the miracle that people say, like, whoa, St. Paisios was able to communicate to these
Mm-hmm.
animals. And I do believe there's a layer of, when you look at the scripture, that we're meant to have that kind of divine connection to other sentient beings in this way, where we, learn from them, and God reveals himself through the creatures on this earth and all their different personalities and traits. And a lot of the saints have really written about a lot of this stuff. So I think it's just such a beautiful idea to understand that dominion is this, reciprocal natured connection with other living beings on earth, that's also defined in that ideal as one that doesn't require, death and then or killing. And then
Mhm.
later on, when that connection's broken, and when we start engaging in some of that, there is these guidelines like the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, et cetera, that come into play. But the highest ideal doesn't even need it. It's just natural. It's natural.
Mhm.
It's like St. Paisios being like, oh, the ants need food. Let me get them some
Right.
food.
That's it's very well said. I mean, I totally agree. Like a natural cascade of that primary step, then waterfalls down into Elder Saint Paisios talking about this love of every creature.
Right.
Um, but it's also funny, it's like you have to be careful what barrel you drink from. I mean, to some extent, again, I just find it such a funny irony that if you go and find Orthodox monks throughout the world and ask them about their concept of eating meat, it's for different reasons that they don't, but they
Right.
ultimately eat less and kill less than
Mhm.
I guess some of those Buddhist monks that you interviewed.
Right.
um, and so it's funny how when you get your life in the right orientation, things just kind of naturally consequence as a
Right.
result of that. But you're right. I mean, in many ways, many of the fathers say that Jesus himself was sort of the second Adam,
Mhm.
in that he came to restore us back to this original state. And again, as a Greek Orthodox Christian, where the thesis is, hey, the apostles were made apostles by Jesus, the apostles made bishops, the bishops, so on and so forth, from A to Z, the spiritual genealogy, all the way to a bishop that I know. They passed on a lot of pastoral and oral traditions, and I wouldn't say mandates, but a tradition that they are to follow. And one of those major traditions is one of fasting, and specifically, even outside of the more stringent fasting seasons, they don't eat meat ever again. And I don't think that's coincidence, because it follows the let's say that the practices within all aspects of the Orthodox Church that we're trying to mimic some type of original state. I mean, everyone talks about that, but we actually have, let's say, a spiritual genealogy to that point. When Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise, they were promised three things, and it was suffering, it was work, and it was death. And you might imagine that prior to the fall, those things didn't exist. And so I don't, as an Orthodox Christian, I don't think there's any theological mandate that requires me to believe certain things pre-fall. Like we have a certain general sense of what that was like. I don't know to what extent, Adam would run through the jungle to name the animals or walk through the jungle. Like it doesn't matter. But we do appreciate, though, that he was a steward and that he did take care of the garden, and that death was not supposed to be his destiny, and that sin was not supposed to be his destiny, and perhaps even killing something was not supposed to be his destiny. And I do think that you're absolutely on point, that as Jesus tries to restore mankind to its original theosis, its original divine state, that practice of killing is not necessarily the highest good. Cameron, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
So again, just to speak about orthodoxy, in some ways the spiritual life is an ever receding line. You overcome X, and then there's Y to do, and then there's Z to do, and then there's always another thing, Z.1 and Z.2. So in the Orthodox tradition, marriage is a very positive thing. Intimacy is a very positive thing. Procreating is a very positive thing. We don't get married just to procreate. I don't think we're as stringent as the Catholics, but it is seen as a good thing. But when you become a monk, you have to take a vow of celibacy. So this is different from
Right.
Roman Catholicism. There is a certain self-selection of people who are very theological, very pastoral, that become priests and they get married. But then there's another round of those that become clergy and they don't get married. Now, this is the thing. We don't believe that sex is wrong. We don't believe that it's sinful. It's appropriate in certain contexts. It's then eliminated in other roles. So I guess my question to you is, knowing again the thought process of the Orthodox Church, we as Orthodox Christians fast from meat probably 200 days a year, maybe more, maybe less, depending on the year. It's just part of what we do. The monks never eat meat.
Mhm.
Uh, the laity do get married and have intimacy. The monks do not do that anymore. So in some way, there's this ever ascending state that we yearn for, that not everyone is capable of, but that there is a recognition of that optimized state. I guess my question for you is: do you see the consumption of meat, the killing of animals, as something that maybe is Christ-like, and not to do, rather not to do is Christ-like, but is there a place for it outside of, I don't know, outside of that elite crew that can pull it off? I get how would you wrestle with that? Is there a certain something that we strive for, or is this like is this something that we just no one should ever do?
Well, I think it's pretty clear in the scripture, like I said, with the Edenic ideal and also the ideal in the kingdom of heaven, as it's described, that there is no killing or consuming of animals. But
Mm,
here in this state, obviously, there's tons of people participating in that. And like you say, there's this gradient, I feel, let's just hone in on Christianity, gradient, like you said, of those who participate in that versus the more monastic you get or ascetic you get, the more that seems to fall away, to where there are, monks and ascetics who are just natural full on vegetarians or maybe even vegans because of their
yep.
ascetic practice going to that extent. I mean, I do think that we all have the possibility and potentiality to reach that state. And I think that it's worth striving for a number of reasons that we can talk about. But kind of going back to, Jesus, like the idea of marriage and that analogy that you're using,
Yeah, yeah.
it makes me think about on this journey. One of the things that I noticed, is when Jesus is asked about divorce in the
Mm,
Gospels, he says, well, from the beginning, it was not so, but
mm,
because your hardness of heart, that's now been permitted as a consequence of hardness of
yes.
heart, right? And what's interesting is if you go into the Syriac version of the Gospel of Luke, which is, Syriac is like a sister language to Aramaic. So it's a really, really ancient tradition.
Mm,
There's preserved in there in Luke chapter 21, I believe it is, where he says, don't let your heart become heavy or hardened by the eating of flesh, consumption of wine, and the anxieties of the world. Now, we have that verse a little bit differently in our Greek Gospels because that eating of flesh has been changed to, I can't remember whatever word they put there, but the consumption of wine and the anxieties of the world are present in the verse, but the consumption of flesh part isn't. And so
mm,
it kind of leads me to wonder, is there some earlier tradition or tradition, at least amongst the Aramaic speaking Hebrew followers, that had that idea that made its way into that Syriac gospel? And it matches to me this idea that maybe Jesus is saying, like, hey, you know, this is here and this happening, but it's a consequence of our hardness of heart. So the more that you work on opening your heart to God, the more that you work on your relationship in that hierarchical order that you talked about, where the ideal is at the top and it's striving towards this heavenly vision on earth, the more that the heart opens and the more that falls away. And I think, if we go from a scriptural sense, that's the goal for everybody, is to enter that, kingdom of heaven state. I do think, like you said, we have these outliers, the monks, the ascetics, the different people that are willing to take that path. But I do think that it's a little bit, personally, I think that, getting into conversations of celibacy versus not, all these kinds of things, I look a lot of times back to the earliest movements, the Nazarenes and these early Christians, and kind of what they practiced. And the Nazarenes, for instance, were very, very similar to the Essene sect. There's ways that you can draw, connections, which is some of the reason why Jesus is always rebuking the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because there's these outlier kind of opinions that are coming in to the mix in Judaism. But the Nazarenes ended up separating themselves from the Essenes because they allowed for marriage. Like the Essene sects, they were like the monastics of Judaism. They were out in the caves, and most of them, there's different factions, obviously, but the majority of them actually were celibate as well. So
mm.
I think there's this idea that, like, no, again, dominion is that first command, and then not long after that is be fruitful and multiply. So it's seen as this beautiful, godly ordained thing to, find a partner and create more humanity on the world. But I think that along with that, the ideal human state or the ideal human nature is to respect all living beings, to have this dominion mindset that's one of service. And it leads you ultimately to the conclusions. If your heart is soft and open, it leads you to the conclusions that from an ethical standpoint, Uh, and from a scriptural standpoint, that, the ideal is to eliminate that, which is why I think the Daniel fast even exists. The prophet Daniel in Babylon, he's seen as fasting, right? And that's what I did as a Daniel fast. It's 10 to 21 days, no meat consumption. It's very specific in the scripture that he only ate vegetables and water, or pulses is the word, which is like a seed bearing plant.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get the extra canonical material from Josephus, the historian, who is in apologetics the guy that most people use to prove the existence of Jesus historically outside of the Gospels, right? Well, that same Jewish historian is writing on his traditions and the rabbinical traditions around the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and he speaks more expansively that it's the understanding from the Jews of that time that Daniel abstained from eating any living creature, period. Like that was his idea, and it was a lifestyle, it was a diet. It wasn't just 10 days to 21 days. It was literally how he and his brothers lived. And so I think when we look to these kind of ideal conditions, it peeks his head up through the scripture all the time. And so, yeah, I mean, not everyone's there right now, obviously, but I think that that's the goal of Christspiracy, is just to get more people asking this question for themselves and see if they're willing to at least take a fast. I like to say cleanse the temple, like
Sure.
Jesus did, and just really see how it feels, see what comes through, and ultimately along the process really learn where your food is coming from. Because let's face it, the large majority of animals consumed on planet Earth, period, are factory farmed. 99% of all animals or animal products consumed on planet Earth are factory farmed. So that leaves 1% or less that are in some form of like let's call it, grass fed, pasture raised, all these practices that people are trying to do to make the conditions better. That's
Right.
such a small percentage. And I truly believe that, we can get into the conversations that in the claims of Christspiracy around the Nazarenes and Jesus and animal consumption and anything. But before even going there, just looking today where we are, I would say 99% of what we're doing has to go, because that for sure is not, it's the farthest from the ideal it could be, because these animals, and they're in cages and they're just fed horrible diets, GMO, the vaccinations, all the things, their entire life is suffering from beginning to end. So I definitely think that most people would agree with that. We see a pretty broad consensus these days that people are against factory farming. They just don't know how prevalent it is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would take one step above that and say that if your society is so materialistic and so instant gratification oriented and so materialistic, that again, what waterfalls from that is industrialization, and let's just say this abuse of animals. Now, I'm not necessarily in abuse of animals. I'm not really going to stand out and put a signs up to protect them, but I would put signs up to bring to light to the world that they're materialistic and instant gratification is not the way. And from that, we probably, like, if the whole world was Orthodox and we fasted the way that we did, and we didn't eat meat for 200 days of year, and we had these seasonal dynamic changes, and we weren't slaves to our bellies and to impulse and to many of the things that Western society is so famous for. In fact, it's glorified for it. It would the food supply to support that priority, that paradigm, would be very different.
Right.
And it's just always a wild to me because as a doctor's perspective, I find it very disturbing that 100 million people in America have prediabetes or diabetes. That
Mhm.
as the baby boomers become senior citizens, there's a huge dementia epidemic that's going to be striking. Because a lot of them have diabetes, and that's one of the major risk factors. That so many people are overweight, that as a result of that they can't play with their grandkids. Like there's many ways to describe the downstream effects of this primary ill, which is one of materialism and instant gratification. And for that matter, I think fasting is an incredible cure for that, because if anything is not instant gratification, it's fasting.
Mhm.
So if I could take a child and teach them that viscerally at a young age, what type of person would they become? Well, Probably not one that's led by their belly. And as a result of that, what would society look like around them? Probably one that's a little bit more kind and courteous to, sentient beings all over. So,
Right.
um, so anyway, I feel like I eventually get to where you're saying, and I do think though I wanted to explore this one aspect of your documentary more directly, because it kind of leaves off the listener with this grasping of animal sacrifice and
Hmm.
its place in in Jesus's in Jesus's messaging to the world about how we need to get rid of that.
Hmm.
Now, according to the New Testament and the Orthodox understanding, God, Christ himself was the last sacrifice. We didn't need to have any more blood on bulls thrown on altars, etc. But he didn't come to the world to save animals. He came to the world to save mankind. As a result, there's no more animal sacrifice. And so in that way, and then 1,000 years later, maybe women get better rights. Like it's better to live in a Christian society. Like all these things waterfall from that. I guess what I'm wondering, much like I'd be wondering if I went on a date with a girl and people said, "Hey Pete, what was it like?" And it's like, "Hey, I love the pizza." No, Pete, what was it like to date the girl? Like, take her out? Did you like her? No. I was only there for the pizza. I guess what I'm wondering is, Christ coming down to the earth, in my mind, the reason he was there was to save mankind. The secondary order effect of that was that animal sacrifice was done away with. Just like me going on a date with the girls, not to eat the pizza that we ate together, it was to date the girl. So I guess I just wanted to hear your prioritization of Jesus coming down to the earth, because obviously it was very interesting to hear what you said about the drainage system underneath the temple. I mean,
Hmm.
I know even in the Old Testament it talks about the number of bulls and sheep that were sacrificed couldn't even be counted. It was such a
Right.
bloodbath. Um, how do you prioritize and interpret that, and what are you really trying to say when you mention that God was so infuriated by the animal sacrifice going on in the temple?
Yeah. So we interview Dr. Deborah Rook in a particular scene that you may remember. It's usually most people's favorite scene of the film when they watch it, but she's a Hebrew scholar that really breaks down when Jesus goes into the temple. He gets upset. He flips the money changers tables, which we all know that part of the story. But Christspiracy really explores this additional aspect that we often miss, which is that he frees the animals from the temple as well. It says in the Gospel of John, he drives the sheep and the cattle out. The other Gospels as well all mention freeing the merchants, but the merchants are the ones selling the animals. They often do mention the doves. And ironically, the money changers are mentioned after the cattle dealers in every single gospel, and in the Gospel of Luke, the money changers aren't even mentioned. So there's this idea that we're exploring in the film, this focus shift of maybe we've missed this aspect that Jesus was just, only upset about the corruption around money and corrupting God's house through ripping people off with the exorbitant prices and these kinds of
Yeah.
things. That maybe he was also equally upset with the animals being sold for sacrifice based on those actions. And also this statement where he says, "My house is meant to be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves."
Mhm.
That word thieves seems to lend towards this idea of money changing. But when you realize that he was quoting the prophet Jeremiah, and the Hebrew word behind thieves is actually a violent one or a murderer, it draws a more holistic picture, knowing that no humans were being murdered or anything like that in the temple. It was the animals that were being killed. That's the bloodshed. And in fact, in Ezekiel 18:10, that word paritz, which is the word translated thieves in the Gospels, which by, the Gospels are written in Greek. So the word in Greek is actually lestes,
Mhm.
but lestes implies a violent robber, not just a thief. So there's even in the Greek, there's this idea of violence. Jesus is mad about violence. But Jesus would have been speaking Hebrew in the temple to the Hebrew priests. So we go back to Jeremiah, who he's quoting. It's clear that it's a den of murderers or violent ones, right? Also in Ezekiel, like I said, in Ezekiel 18:10, that word paritz is used, violent one, and it's actually defined in the verse as a shedder of blood. So you can
Mhm.
go look that up for yourself, Ezekiel 18:10. But bottom line, through all this deep research, we conclude at this one heightened moment of the film where we ask this Hebrew scholar about this translation, and she reveals that translation of violent ones or murderers. She's kind of shocked. She's never seen it before either. And I say to her in the documentary, if you pick up on it, I say, oh, so Jesus isn't just saving humans, but he's also saving or liberating animals as well in this process, or stopping animal killing as well in this process. And she
Well,
said,
God was supposed to come to save all creation.
right,
You know, I mean,
it's the restoration of all
sure,
things, is,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so the idea is, hinging on that, that's the piece from the documentary, but this documentary only really scratches the surface
Mhm.
to the overall thesis of this argument. And so, pairing with that, without boring everyone half to death with all the details, the bottom line is, in the beginning, like we've already covered in the Garden of Eden, there's no killing or bloodshed of
Mhm.
animals, right? The kingdom of
Sure.
heaven doesn't have that either. Jesus is always calling in the kingdom of heaven. He says in the Lord's Prayer, may God's will be done, the kingdom of heaven here on earth as it is in heaven, right? And so that's the idea, is moving towards that ideal. And so, in the same way that, yes, humans have sin, folly, the ways that we fall short, that we need to be redeemed. And in so much of that redemption, we can clearly see how society has been shaped by the principles that Jesus and Christianity, if you want to say that, have established in the world. Like you mentioned, rights of women and some of these things, some of these after effects,
Yeah.
based on the principles of loving your neighbor, even turning the cheek, all these kinds of concepts, right? But one of these central ones that I don't feel like is talked about enough, and I would argue from looking at the scripture and really studying the first century movement, might have been the most central, not because animals are in somehow more important than humans or anything like that,
Mhm.
but how we do anything is how we do everything. And so when Jesus says, love the least of these, the most vulnerable sentient being on earth are farm animals in a lot of ways, because they're, along with babies, they are so vulnerable. And they have, they're defenseless lambs or whatever. We see Jesus holding the lamb. That's why that image is so powerful, is because it's this vulnerable being that needs that kind of protection and needs that kind of reconciliation or restoration. So when you see from the Garden of Eden and sin, the first big cleansing or restoration of the earth is the flood, right? But when you look into what happened right before the flood, the earth is full of corruption
Sure.
and what's the other word? Corruption and
Violence. I think it
violence.
was
Violence. Yeah,
violence,
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. The earth is full of violence and corruption. And that word corruption in the Hebrew is shakath. And that word shakath, the Hebrew root of that word shakath, is animal slaughter. So the shoket is the priest who slaughters the animal in the temple. It's the same. It comes from the same root that shakath does, and shakita is the process of slitting the throat and bleeding it out and doing all of
Mhm.
that. So all of these words are rooted in the same idea of flesh and killing of animals. And so when you see the process of animal sacrifice in the Old Testament leading up to particularly that moment, with in Genesis with the flood, there's this ancient idea that there was this devolution and just mass killing and mass murder of humans too. There's this
Sure.
idea when you get into the Enochian tradition and some of that, which is kind of the Messianic Jewish movement, was reading a lot of those materials. There was this idea that the fallen angels, and there was all this corruption, and they were taught war and how to make weapons, and a part of that would have been killing beings. And so it reached such a heightened state that literally the earth is cleansed with the flood. But then after that, as it resets, it builds back up into this same system again. The texts end up just reflecting more and more this concept, and you keep seeing these prophets calling back to, wait a minute, like Jeremiah 7:22 says, God never commanded animal sacrifices when he called you out of Egypt. So when Jesus shows up at the temple, he's coming out of this Nazarene movement. He's called Jesus the Nazarene, and it's a sect of Judaism recorded by Epiphanius, the church father. He's condemning them quite a lot because he's condemning Jewish sects and everything in his writings. But they were an ancient sect that broke off of traditional Judaism because they didn't participate in animal sacrifices. They felt it wasn't, of God. They felt like it was a corruption to the temple, that God's house was always meant to be a house of prayer, like Jesus said, for all nations, but you've made it a den of murderers. So to me, when I read that from a historical perspective and knowing the nature of Christ as he resonates all throughout the scripture, I think that a part of, yes, the ultimate goal is restoring humanity and bringing humanity
Yeah.
back in right relationship with God. But I think a key piece is restoring that relationship of man with more vulnerable, how man serves on this planet and acts. And the way to be more Christ-like and to reflect that original ideal is to stop those things. And that's why it stopped. I believe, it's been 2,000 years and there's been no temple in Jerusalem with all this animal sacrifices and everything. So in that way, that mission was accomplished. Now, there's all kinds of different interpretations, and not everyone's going to agree with my interpretation of this, but we can all agree that it actually did stop. I'm just saying that when you look at the first century movement, when you get behind the Gospels and even back into the original Hebrew Gospel of Matthew and some of this, which again, we only barely scratched the surface in Christspiracy, you begin to understand there's this tradition that really saw that a big part of human corruption, along with all the cheating, all the stealing, all the idolatry,
These
everything that
things
was,
run together.
yeah,
Yes, they
it
run
all
together.
runs together.
They're all
Exactly.
part of the same territory. I
Yeah.
agree. I agree. And again, I think any of my critiques might just be the prioritization or the sequence in which we arrive at the same end, because I think it makes a difference. Two questions for you. There is this assumption. A lot of girls like a guy who has a pet, right? Oh, this guy's walking a dog. He's so kind to the dog. He takes care of the dog. I guess in some ways, like, it makes sense to me. You find a person as a proxy of their compassion. Oh, this is taking care of the most vulnerable. But
Mhm.
I actually don't see that working out in real life. Like, sometimes the guy who has a dog is the biggest selfish bastard in the world. And because he can chain up the dog outside when he has something else to do, like, you know, it works out for his lifestyle when he's at the gym and he's tracking his macros and he's trying to achieve various things. He has no wife, no children, no community. He's just
Mhm.
an N of one. So I feel like there's something there that is necessary but not sufficient. In other words, I would completely agree that a Christ-centered, selfless person is going to take care of the most vulnerable. But I
Yeah.
also see that not everyone in that room taking care of the most vulnerable is actually selfless. Some of them have figured out a way to almost like virtue signal, like,
Yeah.
oh, to my convenience, I love my pet, and but
Yeah.
I'll never have children, I'll never have a wife, I'll never be a part of the community, and I love to be on X. I don't know, I'm sort of making up a scenario here, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there's got to be some statistic to prove it. As I watch couples that are pushing their dog on a stroller, like, again, I'm not trying to say that that's not kind, but there's
Yeah.
something that's almost being abused there. So
Yeah.
whatever that means, I'd be interested to hear your reply.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if I would call it pushback, but I would say that the guy who has a dog and seems so sweet, but then chains it up so he can go work out, probably, yeah, he's virtue signaling, and that's not what I'm talking about. Because
Right, right, right.
having it, for one thing, too, I'm not even really talking about pets, because companion animals, most people in the world, unless you're in, like, some of the areas of China and Asia that eat dogs, they don't kill and eat them. They have them as pets. I'm specifically speaking of the 90 billion land animals every single year that are killed to be consumed. That's just land animals. If you add the fishes around the world that are consumed every year, we get into the countless trillions. You can't even count it.
Huh.
And in the most brutal ways, in the most unjust, with humans involved too, like the fishing industry is one of, if not the most prolific industry for human trafficking and child slavery. I mean, it's awful because they're off in the ocean and there's no regulations, and they are able to force them into labor out there.
Hmm.
But bottom line, I would be, yes, of course there's going to be people who virtue signal, but I feel that, yeah, there's something in the heart that ultimately is compassion, empathy, the fruits of the spirit, that come through that
Yeah. Because
connection
Cameron,
to.
when I watched that documentary, I heard about it because I heard about it much earlier before actually watching it. The first thing I asked when I saw that was, "Is the narrator and the guy with the beard, do they have a wife and children?" It was the first thing I asked, because
Mhm.
I'll tell you, like, there's so many freedom fighters or virtue fighters that in my mind are missing the basics. Now, of course, I know you're married and you have a child. That's great. How,
I mean,
how about how
Kip
about the
has a kid
narrator?
too.
Say
Yeah, yeah,
again.
yeah. Kip's married. He has a kid too.
Oh, he does. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
like I said, it makes me trust the source more. I don't know
Mhm.
why I emphasize that so much, but I just feel like anyone that hasn't gone through the raw reality of family life and children and waking up in the middle of the night and still having to go to work and the balance of things in that real raw way, I
Mhm.
just don't trust their paradigm. I really
Yeah.
don't. And by the way, which is interesting, I say that because monastics in the Orthodox faith, some of them actually do become monastics after they are married and have children. Usually, they're a widower or something like that. But you have to be very careful with the person who has walked away from a certain path that is so incredibly natural without replacing that with something very stringent, which is
Mhm.
why monasticism and asceticism are always one and the same.
Mhm.
You cannot have, which is why I think the Roman Catholic Church really struggles, because you can't have celibate priests who are living like in the world, like doing their thing. I mean, they don't even have pets usually. Like
Yeah.
they don't even have the pet thing. So I distrust it. I distrust it. Not entirely able to articulate why, but I feel better. I feel better knowing that you both have families and children and still feel the way
Yeah.
that you do about animals. Let me just say this though, and I think this is very important. I mean, I truly believe that you are onto something, saying that the historic original state of man was to be a steward, was that death was not really something that we had to deal with, that
Mhm.
killing other animals was not our role. In fact, we were supposed to help them grow and to be optimized and we are all striving to return back to that original state. I believe Jesus came to the earth to ensure that. I also think it's an interesting breadcrumb that the people that we say are a light to man, because God's a light to angels, angels are a light to man, angels are light to monastics, monastics are light to man. I got that phrase wrong, but
Mhm.
that these people who are supposed to show us an example really don't eat meat, and they don't partake in intimacy either. Like there's a lot of things that come with that territory. um, but it's funny. It almost would be like as if you made a documentary on how no one should have sex anymore because the original state was not one of intimacy, Or you could say even better yet, let's just get rid of the women because initially, even like the best paradise was before Eve even showed up. Now that's going to get me like totally written up. But I guess the point is that in some way, I I think all of this takes balance and all of
Mhm.
this takes the right prioritization, and you can come up with interpretations that might not necessarily be true. But I do respect the point that you're making, which is something like a violent society that has no concern for the weakest among us, that does not have a Christ-centered understanding of the balance of life and ritual and ceremony, is probably going to have a lot of problems.
Mhm.
And wow, here we have the United States of America that really doesn't have that prioritization, and we're $38 trillion in debt, and we're in a very chaotic political system. We're all over the world destroying all sorts of different things. And I'm not trying to say I'm not happy to be an American, which again, maybe that's another parallel discussion we can have. Like there's so many things that I don't like about being an American that we do, that I allow to do, that I obviously benefit from by living in this country. But I also recognize that like we shouldn't be doing those things. What
Right.
what, what would you say about that? Because I feel like it's a parallel. It's almost like we recognize that we're not supposed to kill animals. We do anyway. We kind of, but then there's also like this country we live in, which we don't want them to go into Afghanistan. We don't want them to go into these other countries and rape, pillage, and destroy. But we still kind of live here and put up with it. How do we get through that cognitive dissonance?
Right. Well, I think is realizing that it's all connected. And I want to touch on that. That's a great segue into talking about some of the practical implications of today. But I want to just first say, to your point, just a fun little pushback on the idea in Eden. It says that Adam was incomplete because he couldn't find a proper partner
Sure,
after meeting all the
sure.
animals. So then Eve comes, and now there's completion, and it's fully good. And there's even the command to procreate, which is the marriage command, right? But that's all still in the same context of that ideal of
It
Genesis
is.
129, where there's only herbs and fruits for food, and the dominion of the animals is one of more stewardship. So I think that whole picture is actually drawn in such a way that someone can choose to not be, and I totally feel what you're saying about monastics who aren't ascetic and everything and all the problems that can come up with that, for sure. But I do think that common people choosing this through, at first, like you said, and I'm by all means, I'm not someone who doesn't think that there's a process. It's not like
Mhm.
everybody is going to be able to make some drastic change and eliminate all animal products from their life right now, tomorrow. That's what I would love. I personally, that's what I did when I did the Daniel fast. It was
Mhm.
like there was a couple little blips where I had a process where I, started eating dairy and eggs again, and then I tried a little bit of fish and all these things. But I always kept coming back to that ideal because, number one, I felt amazing. Number two, I learned through that process what was actually happening in these industries, and it just fueled me, out of my longing to be as ideal and Christ-like as I could, to just
Right. Right.
remove myself from those systems. But all I was going to say was just push back that, like, I think there is an argument that that ideal does include marriage and these things. We don't have to just say, oh, let's make a like you said,
Yeah.
make
No.
a
Of course.
documentary
Sure.
about
I'm just trying to
men
be
marriage.
inflammatory. No. No.
Yeah, yeah, no, I
Coming
got
from
you.
a guy who's been married 18 years and has 4 kids, I mean, I'm all about having
Yeah,
Eve around and
yeah,
proliferate. So,
yeah.
no argument there.
So
In
to
fact,
your,
it's from that I think, especially in the fallen world, that we then are able to learn. Maybe this is why I don't trust people that have a lot of virtues, promote virtue, that don't have a family life and children, because I think it's through those things that we learn, just like fasting, I would say, we learn much of what it means to have self-control, selfish. There's nothing more overwhelming than waking up in the middle of the night when you're tired for the third time, to help out with a problem with your child. They're helpless. They need help. That's a rite of passage, for that father, for that mother. It's an extraordinary thing. There's nothing in the world like it. For
totally.
example.
Totally. And I'll say too, before getting onto this point about America, because I want to hit that, but
Yeah, yeah.
an expansion on that reminds me of that St. Paisios story and many of these other stories of ascetics and monastics who have this connection to animals, and they write on them and pontificate on them
Yes.
in their stories as if they're learning something about God's nature from the animals too. You know, and then even in the Catholic tradition, we have St. Francis who spoke a lot about this. There's this idea that goes all the way back to, I believe, Rabbi Winkler wrote on this. He's a Jewish rabbi that talked about really, really early Paleolithic Hebrew culture and how the Genesis narrative, the oral tradition developed, and all of these things. And he talked about how these early traditions really saw that because the animals were created first in the creation story and then humans after, that humans are like a culmination of all the animals into one personality, and then imbued with this divine reasoning, the word, the logos, right? That
Okay.
extra connection. But we're able to, through our faculties, look at all of the animal kind and learn about ourselves from all their personalities, the industriousness of the ant, and their form and how
Mhm.
they work together, the cunning of the fox, the contentment of the cow is, one of their ideas that Rabbi Winkler talks about. And when you think about it, he said that a lot of these ancient traditions believe that when we abused or misused or had, not right relationship with those animals or those creatures, we were abusing that aspect of ourselves as well. It's like a reflection. So when you think about if we're just as a society brutally just killing and putting in factory farms all these cows, and if that kind of represents in some ways, you think about them, they're serene, very content, peaceful animals. Maybe there's some aspect of our own self that's being harmed in that process. And he's just saying that's what these early Paleolithic Hebrew tribes believed. So anyways, I think to your point about learning from family and the late nights and all these things, getting out and going to an animal sanctuary, or spending time in the jungle and observing and everything, there's so much that you learn through that interaction that is very, very spiritual, and I think teaches you a lot about yourself as well.
Cameron, have you been to a monastery, an Orthodox monastery before?
I have not, but I really, really hope. You've told me that you have some connections to Mount Athos, and then if I can work it out, I have a pretty solid plan that I think I'll be making it to St. Catherine's later this year.
Yeah.
So maybe I can hit both in one round. I know it's pretty hard to get into Mount Athos, so it'll be a little bit more of a journey to get
Yeah,
there.
we were talking a little bit here and there. It was funny. I was Googling a guy that went to he was a social media guy, and he was trying to do a little documentary on Athos, and he had a very positive experience. But as he tried to go deeper into that, he eventually got sent away because of some
Yeah.
material he had created earlier online.
Right, right.
What was so funny was that, like, somehow the monks all knew. Like, I don't know how they figured this all out. And there was like this concerted effort to get him off the island or off the peninsula. Um, yes, a monastery, when you go there, it is 100% embedded in nature. I mean, speaking to your point of being around that, there is something about being back in that garden, being,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, creation being saved with us and being a
Right.
steward. And there is an oral tradition that many of these grace-filled saints, one of the litmus tests to knowing that they are so in their original state and have achieved theosis is that they can interact with animals in this way.
Right.
Which is probably also why, like, a lot of people find some type of signal when you have a person that loves animals. Like,
Right.
oh, there's something very um original. Like, they're going back to something like, oh, I wonder. I'm going to ask God this in the next life.
Well,
What
it's
is
like
there?
it's like the
Yeah,
innocence of children. We keep talking about our own kids, right? Like, what is
right.
the primary how do I say this? What is the primary first learning device for almost all children? When you look at the books, when you look at the movies, it's always animals, stuffed
Uh-huh.
animals, animal this, all. It's just, I mean, go look at your local children's store or the section, and you look at the
Yeah,
books. They're all
yeah.
animal related and stories telling through animals. There is this innocence and this understanding of being able to connect and learn through that way. And that's why I resonate so much. I think that's why I think orthodoxy is so beautiful. The more I've learned about it, going into spending time looking at the Coptic tradition and everything, which is what I've spent most of my time
Yeah.
looking at, but also Eastern Orthodox, understanding theosis, understanding these ways that orthodoxy really takes this serious. And I think that it would be so powerful to go to a monastery and see that emanate and resonate off of these people there. And I think that it is something that we should all strive for in our everyday life. I don't think, not everyone's going to be able to become a monk or an ascetic or whatever, but I think there's ways we build that in. And that's why I really respect and appreciate what you're doing with the fasting stuff. It's something that we can do in our daily life that brings some of that element, and it builds on itself. I truly believe that the more that you kind of practice some of these ancient traditions, the more it builds on itself, and the more that you begin to understand what the next steps are for you to just, draw closer and closer to that ideal.
Well, those traditions are based on a source,
Hmm.
and that source is God. And there's always a little play on a theme or a little style that can be sort of, a little latitude, let's say, within the theme. But I think what's so amazing about fasting is that it is mentioned 77 plus times across Old and New Testament.
Hmm.
And as far as my research shows, 90% of disease is preventable. And if you fast like a Christian's supposed to fast, not only will you get rid of 90% of disease, but you'll live 40% longer. I mean, this is when God says something 77 times, he might just mean it. And
Yeah.
I think what's difficult, though, as you mentioned, is that fasting can be interpreted as so many different things.
Hmm.
Um, but speaking of that point of learning from these core moments or core rituals or core parts of who we are, you know, if I could take a 7-year old and let him know that he's not supposed to eat meat or dairy on Wednesdays and Fridays, and he goes to school and there's a cupcake birthday party, which always used to happen on Wednesdays and Fridays for some reason in my experience growing up. You know, the first 25 times I might have been pretty pissed off. I might have been judgmental. I might have been wondering, why are these people next door to me like not following the tradition? Why I'm hungry. I have this interest in something that I want. But you know, even if I you know, for whatever reason I didn't fail too many times, but it took so many rounds of that to eventually not care anymore.
Mm.
You know, like I stopped judging at some point. I
Hmm.
stopped having the urge. And if I can teach a 7-year-old self-control and discipline and restraint and not to be judgmental, you know, that is a recipe for being successful in everything.
Yeah.
You know, what project, what company, what movie production doesn't benefit from a person who has self-control, restraint, patience, discipline, you know, and is not judgmental. And
Yeah.
so, but the next part of it, which makes it so key, is that experience wasn't learned by me. It was felt by me. It was felt in my belly, like it was felt in my heart, like it was a visceral experience. And this is why I think this concept of food and how it interacts with us is just so powerful, because somehow I think what your thesis also is that if you were to take a society to take what you're saying seriously, that you reverse engineer and you scale and scope that up, what does that world look like? And it probably looks a little bit better than the one we're in now. However, I guess my follow-on question is, if the Hindus don't eat meat, like why the hell is it so miserable over there? I'm saying that's so terrible, but like they have a caste system, their gods are like bloodthirsty. Like I don't, you know, something doesn't match up in that regard, and maybe that's where I would throw in maybe this the second part, which is that if you don't have Christ as your center and these other effects, second, third, fourth order effects in the right alignment, if you have all of that then pointed to the right goal and aligned and synchronized, then suddenly something magical occurs.
Right.
And I would point to the Orthodox monks to kind of prove that, as you in interviewed some of these people and you saw the hypocrisy, yet there was so pinnacle to what they represented. Then you have these Orthodox monks. I wish you would interview them, because you
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to find any inconsistency there, as they're making these like beautiful gardens in Mount Athos. You know, they're fluorescent. It's so nutritious. It's really an experience. I really hope you go there. And if my family can help you get there, we are so happy to be a part of your journey. But you know, that is heaven on earth. And but it takes the right orientation and it takes the right synchronization. And so yeah, I'm excited to see what you do next. Really,
Yeah.
it's
Well,
very
what I would say about my time visiting out east in the Hindu, I mean, we go to India in our film and we
yeah, yeah.
chase down these cattle mafia trucks, which are, you know,
Oh, that
illegally
must have been
taking.
so exciting, man. I watched that and my heart was just like flying. I'm like, you must have been having the time of your life. What an adventure. Just to throw
Yeah,
that in there.
it was an insane adventure. Definitely even like scary at sometimes. I
Oh,
mean,
it seemed like.
similar to the whole mention of fasting, as we all know, the famous "do not fear" is all throughout the Bible. So I try my best to not like let that dictate my life. But it was definitely a exhilarating, yeah, experience being over there. And honestly, too, without the little bit of knowledge that I do have of a lot of these Eastern religions, that I, like I said, I mean, I've studied in researching for the film and everything, and know quite a bit. But a lot of it comes down to hypocrisy and
Uh,
infiltration and business interests and everything. I mean, even though we know of it in our minds as India and the Hindu culture is vegetarian, most of them don't practice it. I mean, it's so
okay.
infiltrated. They're the biggest, largest exporter of beef. Like, right, they used to be full on the largest, but I think now they're kind of trailing behind China and Brazil. But um,
That is
you know,
so crazy. That is
it's
that's
just no
crazy.
one's actually really following it, and there's all kinds of political, religious things going on with, you know, how the Hindu and Muslim clashes make it so that the Muslims do all the dirty work, killing all their animals for them
Uh,
because they're not supposed to. So there's all these loopholes, and Hindus are drinking tons of dairy and pouring it around for their ceremonies and everything. And
Hmm.
that means that more cows have to be made, which means more cows have to be killed. So it's like there's just a lot of underbelly hypocrisy and things that aren't actually aligning with the original principles that they have as well. So they're not really following it. But that brings me to the point actually around, earlier you mentioned living in America, and it's the same kind
Oh
of
yeah.
thing. Where in America, there's all these hypocrisies and, the war and this and that, and what's really beneath all of that. Well, that's why I do say, and we kind of make this kind of claim in our film, that somewhere close to the root, if not the root of a lot of the issues that we face in our world that we're all trying to combat and want to do better with, come down to that fundamental disconnect with how we treat animals. Because herding cultures, historically, there's Pulitzer Prize winning books written on this concept, the Germs, Guns, and Steel, etc.,
Mhm.
that ancient cultures, when they started herding animals, they started using up their resources for their land, because it takes so much more resources to grow, herded animals. But at the same time, it became the measure of their wealth. So like capitalism, or capital, that word comes from head of animals. Pecuniary interest comes from cattle. The stock market, right, comes from
Hmm.
livestock. uh,
Interesting.
the word fee that we use a lot, that's tied to money, comes from cattle and animals as well. So there's this idea that these ancient cultures measured their wealth in terms of the heads of animals they had in their tribe. But at a certain point, they overextend their resources, and they have to figure out a way to get more. So they go conquer their next tribe to get their resources and maybe their cattle too, and expand their wealth, right? But the only reason that they're able to do that, which these anthropologists look at, is before they started herding, they saw animals more like this Hebraic way that I saw, or this Edenic dominion, where they're stewards of them. They have this spiritual connection and they honor them in a certain way. But then when they break that and start hurting them in this way, they break that connection. And that's a fundamental like discrimination, if you will. So it allows them for the first time to be like, okay, these animals, even though I know they're living beings and I know I need to protect them and care for them, this and that, these are the ones that are food and these are the ones that aren't. It's kind of like what we do with pets, like dogs versus pigs. Like dogs, we love them, keep them, they care for them, keep them in our house. Pigs, they're to be eaten. But really, pigs are like more intelligent than dogs. They're like very,
Right.
similar. So
Right.
there's
Who
these
knew?
fundamental distinctions that I think creates, there's a lot of psychologists that have talked about how this fundamental disconnect creates that level of discrimination that allows for, now, if I'm a herding culture and I need to go conquer this other tribe, I'm able to do so because, number one, I've developed tools and weapons for killing the animals that I'm herding, that now I can turn and go kill my fellow man with, so that I can get his resources. And then the plunder afterwards is the women and children left over after battle. And that's where slavery is introduced, because women and children were the first slaves. And then maybe some of the leftover males are taken as slaves or whatever. But like war, so the word war, the original one, again, talking about India, the most ancient word for war ever used comes from the Vedas. It's Gavasti, or Gavia, and it's tied to the word cow. It literally means a desire for more cattle. It's actually featured in what's that famous movie about that alien invasion? Oh, I can't remember, but they mentioned
There's
this
so
line.
many,
Yeah, they mentioned this
alien
line.
films.
But
Yeah.
how the ancient word for war means desire for more cattle. So all that brings me to this point about America. Right there, at we were just talking about the stock market and how this system and our financial system is built on this. And it goes all the way back to these ancient temple systems, and how these herding cultures eventually got powerful enough that they created massive temples and slaughter complexes to be able to slaughter all these animals. That is tied to our current economic system that we have in America. And look no further than the symbolism of the Wall Street bull, the charging bull, right there in Bowling Green Park. And it's this bull that's golden. What does that remind us of? Baal, the golden bull from, the time of Moses, sitting there, that's meant to be about prosperity and wealth and all of this hedonism that's surrounding it. But there, and you can go to this day. I'm actually going to release a video on this. I went to Wall Street just to kind of poke around the Wall Street bull and see what's going on. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but they go take photos with it and they hold the testicles of the bull and they like rub it. It's like a good luck. fertility thing. And it's all very ritualistic and
You
reminds
sure
me
it's
of
just not a bad joke?
well,
Yeah, it should be good.
it reminds me of like that story of Moses and the people down there worshiping around this golden bull. But that stock market, Bowling Green Park, where that cow is, that was a cattle yard, and that was one of the first
Mhm.
things ever built in that area. And so this whole concept of livestock, chattel, etc., our financial system and what's corrupt about it is built on it. Our warmongering machine and what's corrupt about it has its origins in it. Slavery, so many injustices you can tie back to this fundamental mistreatment, disconnect, and discrimination that happens when you subjugate one being, and that's okay, but you don't subjugate these beings. I mean, everything, our pharmaceutical system, so many people, I know you're in medicine, and I'm sure that there is, I don't know what all your beliefs are around that. There's some practices that are amazing about the medical system, but being who you are, I'd imagine you'd say like the pharmaceutical industry at times can prey on people's sickness, and it's more of a what do you call it? Like a it's not trying to get to the solution. It's trying
Yeah,
to
symptomatic management.
symptomatic management,
Symptomatic
right?
management. I mean,
And
that's a huge universe of discussion, and
yeah,
but before I went to medical school, I actually owned a chiropractic, like a wellness center. We had
mhm,
massage therapists, a chiropractic, acupuncturist. I only bring this up to say that we had the coolest population of people who actually cared about their health and listened to what we said. And what I mean is why the reason I bring that up is, and I think a lot of it's conditioning as well. I mean,
right,
people are certainly praised to a lot of things. Like you said, you finally woke up at 17, or and all of us do this in our own way, in our own timeline. But
right,
it's truly clear to me that many patients don't want to put any work into getting better at all. The recipe for good health is pretty simple. In fact, one of the reasons I bring up this book, the Athos Diet, is because it's just so incredibly miraculous that the cure to 90% of the disease is so simple, that living a long
right,
life is so simple. But a lot of people don't want to do it because it's just difficult. And I'm not saying it's not difficult, but
yeah,
what's the alternative? But it's nice oftentimes in these self-selection industries like chiropractic, acupuncture. Most of the people that show up to those areas have had epiphany moments like yourself, and
yeah,
they are ready to put in the work and do whatever it takes, including you could say avoiding eating certain things,
yeah,
which is whether that's meat or fast food or processed food, you name it. But absolutely, one of the reasons I became an ER doc was because I actually wanted to be a family doc, and then realized that those guys have like 5 minutes a patient, have no influence on anyone they're actually taking care of, are
mm,
not focused on the actual cure. And I'm
yeah,
like, hey, if I have to just focus on putting out fires, I'm just going to be an emergency medicine doctor. Like
right,
I don't care if you smoked, like your whole life. I mean, we don't even have time to talk. I gotta put BiPAP on your face and intubate you because you failed that, and we have to put medicine in you. Like and one of the reasons I wrote this book was because of that cognitive dissonance. That
yeah.
I don't have time, and the system's not set up for doctors to actually have real meaningful conversations. In fact, it's the documentaries like your friend that put together that are probably doing more for keeping the masses out of bad health than I'll ever do. I just do that one patient at a time. You know.
Well, the benefit of that is I really feel, unfortunately, and maybe someday this will change, but the majority of humans, the human nature is that you don't really make a change until there's an ultimate catastrophe.
Right.
Most
Right.
people need that emergency room visit or that intense final scare where they
Yeah.
finally are open to like, hey, maybe I should think about fasting. Maybe I should think about eliminating or at least minimizing my consumption of these products in animal flesh, whatever it is that you're consuming that is affecting your health. And the beauty is that these, we've been talking a lot about ethics, and I really think that is the core, and it's the message of Christspiracy and what I'm getting at in terms of really understanding what's happening with our animal agriculture industry on the planet. But there's this beautiful byproduct, waterfall down, like you said earlier,
Yeah.
that our health gets better. The
Yeah.
outcomes from minimizing or eliminating these foods is outrageously positive across the board, and you see it all the time. I mean, I know there's in your book, And at Mount Athos, there's just the health of these elders is just
Yeah.
unbelievable. And we've got the blue zone studies and all of these things that show that it's massively beneficial. And then on the flip side, like what I was saying is, with the pharmaceutical industry, even not that long ago, we had COVID, right? And there's this kind of idea of epidemics and pandemics that have entered people's minds, but we've had them all throughout history, and they're linked, almost all of them, to animal domestication. Swine flu, bird flu,
Or
uh,
bioweapon labs.
or bioweapon labs.
Honestly,
But
I really start to wonder as I'm doing research to, in theory, you'll talk to things like, what's it? Not Epstein, Weinstein. You
right,
know, he's a philosopher, kind of
yeah,
biology guy, and he's just talking about how incredibly rare it is for viruses to kind of jump across species unless
yeah,
they were made in a lab. And you just start thinking about, like, oh my god, like, was AIDS that, like, what, there's just so many things that
yeah,
have occurred. You just start wondering, like, in our greed, in our societal effort to be bigger, more powerful, more curious for the sake of, without any real meaning, just to see what we can do. Damn, we just brought back a freaking wolf, a dire wolf. I
right,
mean,
right,
I hope that's a nice pet. It might also
yeah,
have unleash some unknown, problem. But sometimes, just for the curiosity's sake, speaking of human nature, we bring out a lot of problems, and you just
yeah.
start thinking very nervously, like,
Well,
what
well,
we're
even I'm with you on that. I go down all the rabbit holes, and I'm
sure
definitely down with the idea of how much is actually just being manipulated behind the scenes, bioweapons, these kinds of things.
it's
But
possible.
even if that's the case, it's like, we have something like mad cow disease, which hit, back in, I don't know if you remember that. I think I was pretty young when that was really
Yeah.
flaring up. But they've linked Alzheimer's to mad cow disease and these kinds of things, and it becomes it's because of the consumption of the animal, because the cow is eating other cows, right? And it's not genetically supposed to do that. And that mutation, when we then ingest it, that's how it can jump across and it can begin to affect humans. And similarly, vaccinations, there's so much conversation around the positive and negative effects of those, right? But the beyond, starting with the very genesis of where vaccinations come from, the word vaccine comes from the Latin cow, vacca. It means cow, because the first ever vaccines ever
Right.
developed were injections for cows to
Cowpox.
uh, to minimize their cowpox. And so now that function and that system in medicine is now being applied to humans. And so we have all of these different kinds of ways that I feel what we do to other beings in the animal kingdom ends up having a boomerang effect and coming back on us. So, if we're like freedom fighters fighting for all of these things that we're kind of concerned about, like you said, living in modern times in America, some people are concerned about free speech, right? That's a big concern. Well, interestingly, under the Patriot Act, the groups that were labeled the number one terrorist threat in America were animal activists who were going into factory farms and filming the horrible conditions, like literally abusive conditions. Um, and they were silenced under ag gag laws, meaning they can't not only do that, but they can't share something that's true, and if it has any effect to the bottom line of that industry, they can go to jail for it under these ag gag laws.
Well, I think the
So
point is the Patriot Act has been used as an ultimate tool to justify anything that you
yeah,
want to get away with against your enemies, as long as you're in the position of power to use it. I guess I
yeah,
would say this, Cameron. I think it's funny how we all sort of triangulate facts and come up with certain conclusions. And again, I think the only caution I would have to Christspiracy, or really anything that you're highlighting, because many of the facts I think are accurate that you bring up, and the hypocrisy is accurate. And again, I would just always emphasize, at the end of the day, you know, while Adam brought back to paradise, did take care of animals, the reason he was there was to literally walk with God,
hmm
you know. And so as long as that's the first step, and from that priority, everything else kind of finds orientation, I do think the animals eventually get taken care of. In
Mhm.
fact, I would say that if you even try to take on the animal problem before addressing the core problem, there'll be such, well, you just mentioned it, how they abuse the Patriot Act. Like, there'll be no one will understand, no one will be able to process what you're really trying to say, which is, I'm trying to restore mankind to his original state.
Mhm.
And that original state was a divine, Christ-centered orientation. And as a result of that, there was this balance within nature and creation that we all yearn for. And it is so sad to see that creation not respected, because it's a barometer, perhaps, to how close we've come to walking away from God in paradise. And
Yeah.
and so in that regard, it's quite deep what you're emphasizing. My other maybe last thing to bring up, and it's been a great discussion, very robust, is just to say that, okay, we have a Christ-centered thing there. We have certain things in the orientation. I also respect people's journey to eventually get to theosis, and I also respect that journey is difficult. And so, while some people are not quite there, at least we can all agree on a goal. I think that's oftentimes missed in 2025. We're like, oh, there are no goals anymore. We make it up as we go. No, we should respect that there are goals. We might come short of them, but we have a goal. We all recognize it. Um, you know, there will be priest monks and bishops and ascetics and people who really show us how to be like Adam on earth and God on earth. As for everyone else, certainly it's easy to say industrial farming is not the thing to do, um, but yeah, I go back to this what was it, Ellen Fisher podcast.
Mhm.
I mean, again, the hunter in that, he was so enraged. I just couldn't understand what all. Like I said, I told you this before, but whatever he was upset at had nothing to do with you and everything to do with something he had to process through personally. But
Mhm.
you can see that visceral reaction from someone like that with what you're bringing up,
Yeah.
because you're touching some buttons there that really are core to us and core to what we believe and core to how we live our lives. And a lot of people don't want to give up, bad practices. And I'm not saying, again, I actually take incredible. I mean, I'm not like enraged by this to say if you disagree, but every year we have Easter. It's coming up. Pascha, we call it, the resurrection. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm slaughtering a lamb like the next primitive Neanderthal, and it's extraordinary. We rotisserie that thing, and it brings the whole family together. Could I do that with, I don't know, beets and mushrooms or something? I mean, maybe, but there is something very primal there. Is it how it was meant to be? Probably not. Am I a monk? No. Are the monks eating lamb on Pascha? No, no. But I'll get there.
And I
I'm
guess
hoping.
I guess the bigger question
Yeah.
is, did Jesus eat lamb on Pascha? And if he did, how would he kill the animal? How would he kill a lamb?
I mean, there was times in the Old Testament where Saul was kicked out of being king just because he didn't annihilate every living thing from the tribe. He brought back the bulls for sacrifice, and God said, I want obedience, not sacrifice. So, evil is supposed to be destroyed. Not
Mhm.
that animals are evil, but like, there is a point in time where God just gets it done. He will come back in the second coming and judge the earth, and it's going to be tough. It's going to be
Well,
difficult.
what I
So,
would say,
yeah,
for you to maybe chew on with the upcoming Pascha
yeah,
is, because I know the comments are going to be coming anyways. Oh, Jesus ate the Passover lamb. Jesus ate fish. These kinds of things. That's a
yeah,
whole. I thought we would maybe talk about this on this podcast, but we've gone so
yeah,
long. Maybe that's a next one, and I can
yeah.
get in the
Maybe. Yeah,
comments.
I've
I can,
enjoyed it, Cam.
yeah,
I've enjoyed it. Why
I
not?
can get into the comments and answer some of that. But I will touch on the Passover because it's so fascinating. So, like I said, you mentioned, was it the original way? Maybe not. Well, when you look at Jeremiah 7:22, who again, Jesus quotes Jeremiah 7:11 when he said, you've made the temple a den of murderers. And he's saying that at Passover. It's Passover week when he was,
Yes.
entered the temple and did all of this act, which scholarship is in consensus that act was actually what was able to get him convicted at his trial, because otherwise just claiming messianic, being the Messiah, all these things, like the Romans didn't really care about that much, but
Yeah.
disrupting a building like that had all of this financial interest and everything tied, they were like, okay, well, we got to do something about this. But
Great commerce,
right. So Jeremiah 7:11, he says, "You made it a den of murderers." Jeremiah 7:22, Jeremiah goes on to say, God never commanded animal sacrifice when he brought you out of Egypt. Well, what is that? That's the Passover. That's the Passover story. So Jeremiah in the Old Testament is contesting whether or not the lamb slaughter was ever a part of the actual original Passover. Now, this is where Christian, and I'm the same way. I had so much resistance to these ideas. But when you really understand the compilation of the Hebrew Bible and the different source material that's pulled in, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is actually the week of Passover, there's a very strong case to be made that the Passover ritual and the lamb killing was a much later addition around the reign of King Josiah, when Jeremiah was in existence, and that Jeremiah was infuriated about the fact that they were going down this road and centralizing this lamb slaughter threshold ritual at the Temple of Jerusalem. And so when Jesus comes and shows up on Passover and says, "You've made my temple a den of murderers," he also, just before that, says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." It begins to paint a picture that, I mean, even the Elephantine documents of the Jews from Elephantine, that's one of our oldest Passover document rituals. No lamb mentioned. The Passover letter, which is, I think, or is that might be the same as the Elephantine document. Our oldest record of the Passover doesn't have mention of lamb in it. And then what do you have Jesus doing in the Gospels? He disrupts the whole temple complex, and then he goes to the upper room, and what we have recorded is bread and wine, or it's more like a grape juice. It was probably 3% alcohol. There's lots of studies on that as well, that they were diluting their wine like crazy with water and this and that, but that's besides the point. The point
Yeah.
is is Jesus is having this pantomime feast of unleavened bread, which matches the same offering that Melchizedek has in the Old Testament. After Abraham goes on his warmongering campaign and all the sacrifice and everything, he's met by Melchizedek in Jerusalem, and Melchizedek offers the bread and wine. It's this kind of pantomime of the unleavened
Foreshadowing.
bread and the simple food, right? And so I would argue that, yeah, you should consider for Pashka, what if the lamb slaughter was never part of the original ritual, and that's what Jesus was actually condemning. So maybe the ultimate way to express and honor that is through the tradition which Jesus instituted, which is, coming together and breaking bread. I mean, there's so much more I could say about that. Like
Yeah,
our
yeah.
our
Honestly, let's do a second round, because I think we just got warmed up enough to sort of say, hey, if we got more precise and specific about how this would then manifest in religious belief,
yeah
in life, how would that look? Now, again, I know one of the reasons we connected was because I brought this up, that one of the canons of the Orthodox Church is that clergy and monks and priests and bishops are not supposed to even witness the death of an animal, let alone eat meat. So it's a very interesting breadcrumb,
yeah
to indicate that,
pun
again,
pun
right,
intended.
um,
Breadcrumb.
to indicate that in a tradition that is passed on over and over and over again, if I'm being consistent with my own beliefs, which I feel like I must be, you know, why would these monks do something that even Jesus wouldn't do? Well, they're trying to be like Jesus. So it
Right.
makes me feel like Jesus might have been, a vegetarian. Now, with that said, though, I don't know if, while I'm taking care of, the next heart attack and stroke victim and pneumonia in a child, that I'm going to go too deeply into figuring out what Jesus's favorite pie was. Like those things don't really matter to me, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm a part of a 2,000-year-old tradition and a 300 million Christians who have these sages of or the Orthodox faith that can show me the wisdom and the spirit and the pattern of the faith. Now, I also will then say too, this ever receding line of excellence within our own spirituality. Like, hey, if God forbid my wife is a widow, or sorry, dies someday, and I'm a widower, and my children are grown up and they're taken care of, and where am I going to spend my life? In a nursing home? Maybe I'll go to a monastery, and maybe the last 20 years of my life I'll be a vegetarian, and maybe then I'll find theosis and I'll talk to animals. I don't know, but I feel like that is in store for me because
That's
I'm an
awesome.
Orthodox Christian and I'm a part of a tradition that I'm humble enough to accept. And what you bring up is quite interesting, and I think there's some resonation there. But I won't say I don't know. I don't know. I'm gonna have to do some research
Well,
and get back to you,
yeah,
Cameron,
well, how
on the
about this? How about this? How about you do some research?
sure.
Everybody in the comments, put your favorite question, put your top rebuttal or question. I know everybody's got some
Sure.
to some of what I'm saying, and we can just do another podcast and go through some of those questions
Yeah.
and talk through them, because again, I'm only scratching the surface of this conversation and all the research that I've done around this topic. There's going to be so many questions that people will have. Like I said, oh, Jesus ate fish, the Passover lamb, these kind of things. There's a conversation to be had around all of that. It's not that I'm avoiding it or don't know
Yeah,
that
yeah,
it's
yeah.
there. Most
Oh
people
no,
think it's
it's
just a
taking
long
2 hours to
conversation.
get this far. It's taking 2 hours to
Yeah,
get this
yeah.
far. We
But
keep letting
but what I but what
yeah.
I will say is, I think a part of why we don't always know these things and what's going on is that a lot of us don't even understand like the manuscript tradition of the scripture and everything. And the fact, like, one way that it ties into even your practice is, I remember the first time that I ever really understood that there were like biblical variants amongst early manuscripts was
Mhm.
because of fasting. Because I don't know if you're aware, but like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, our oldest, complete
Mhm.
codex manuscripts of the Bible, when Jesus says this kind can only be removed through prayer and fasting, that famous line, in those codex, the word fasting isn't there. And there's multiple instances of the word fasting being omitted from certain texts, ancient codexes and everything. So you can even go in your Bible right now, and there's usually a little asterisk or a mark that says like this isn't existent in certain earlier manuscripts. But then
You're
I
saying that if I contact Father Justin at the Monastery of St. Catherine's that I've been to, that if he opens up the Bible there, that oldest codex that's gigantic, there won't be a prayer, there won't be a fasting word in that incredible story about the epileptic.
Yeah. So in Mark, which is where it would have originated, because Mark's the oldest gospel. I'm 99% sure.
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
let me, but we'll get back on it. If I'm wrong, then
yeah. No,
I'm wrong. But
something
but
for the
I'm
next
99%
conversation. It's
sure.
fascinating.
It's just coming off the top of my head right now. I was just thinking about this, but yeah, the Gospel of Mark in Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus does not have and fasting. It just says this kind will only come out through prayer. And there's other ones. There's an instance of fasting in Acts, which is omitted quite often,
Hmm.
etc. But there's all these variants around the word fasting. It's really interesting. My
Yeah.
conclusion would be, because I know P45, which is, I think, one of, if not the oldest fragment of Mark.
This is Wesley Huff terminology now you're using,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Fragment. Sure, sure.
P45, if I'm not mistaken, fasting's missing from that as well, but it's because the manuscript's damaged. But
Uh
there's
huh.
like a space there where fasting could be. So my I feel that fasting is the original tradition, but maybe there was a reason behind omitting it later on in certain manuscripts,
But
for
just to be
reason.
aware of that, I understand what you're saying. The
Yeah,
theme
yeah.
is,
So
certainly be aware about something. I mean, and again, I just want to emphasize what leads me to believe that there's got to be something wrong with that story. Although you might be very well right. Is 100 years ago, Dr. Conklin took that story very literally, and he essentially made children with seizures permanent. Intractable seizures rather fast for 20 days with only vitamins and water, and the seizures went away. And
wow,
he wasn't a doctor. I mean, well, I guess he was a doctor. He
there
was
you
a
go.
doctor, but he cared about his faith, and he was trying to incorporate something he had read for some medical benefit. So anyway,
Yeah.
I hope to I hope to find out from Father Justin that maybe
Yeah,
it's in there.
ask them.
But
You might be surprised. And then
yeah,
the reason why I bring it up is I'll say we've got these variants in the ancient
yes,
tradition. It doesn't mean that the Bible, we need to throw out the Bible or this or that's not what I'm saying. I'm just
sure,
saying it's good to understand how these variants in the tradition developed. And the reason why I bring it up is because
yeah,
Passover we have preserved by Epiphanius and some of the other church fathers. This idea of a Hebrew gospel of Matthew. And this is what we discussed a little bit in our debate with Wesley Huff, but in other videos as well. And in the sayings of that Hebrew gospel of Matthew, one of the phrases that's preserved is that when Jesus is about to go to the Last Supper and they're going to prepare the Passover, Jesus says, I have no desire to eat the flesh of this Passover lamb. So he full on specifically rejects it. And what's interesting is we have kind of a similar phrase, but not as explicit in our gospels as well. But what we do have is the tradition that they break the bread and the wine. There's no mention that there's any lamb or whatever. But in the original Hebrew gospel, he specifically rejects it. And in fact, in addition, in that same preservation of that Hebrew gospel of Matthew, probably around the same time that Jesus would have said, you've made my temple a den of thieves or a den of murderers, he says in the Hebrew gospel, lest you cease from sacrificing, wrath will not cease from you, meaning that, this practice that you've incorporated is going to continue to bring these consequences which God has instituted. So all that to say, same as fasting comes in and out of our traditions, maybe this original kind of tradition of Jesus didn't make the cut in the later gospels, but it's in this earlier Hebrew Greek gospel. I'm sorry, Hebrew gospel before the Greek. And same thing, like I mentioned, that Syriac gospel in Luke, where Jesus mentions that flesh and wine and the anxieties of the world will harden your heart. It's the kind of things that I like to consider because I just always want to get back the same way that, I was raised Protestant, but now I've gone all the way in Christianity where I'm most fascinated and feel that Orthodoxy is the closest you can get to the original tradition of Christianity. But even before that, into the Hebrew followers of Jesus, that maybe there's still some extra layers to this tradition that pertains to this particular topic that we're talking about that's been lost to history. And I think there's a reason why it's been lost to history, which is part of why we made Christspiracy.
Well, it's a great summary. I mean, on a practical level, Cameron, I would say this: let's say you became an Orthodox Christian and you wanted to be the biggest, baddest, ascetic there ever was. I mean, you could do everything you're describing. There's nothing heretical about it or
Yeah.
theologically inconsistent. I mean, to some extent, I think what's really powerful about Orthodoxy, as well as being historically accurate, is that they also have things just called mystery.
Yeah.
Like, but one of the reasons that it makes me just vomit sometimes listening to a Roman Catholic talk about purgatory and sins of various types and intensities, it's like this is the worst Monopoly game I've ever heard of. Like
Yeah.
they're just making stuff up, and like it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong, but like where's
Yeah.
the mystery? If I'm able to explain everything that God knows and is, then it's probably not God,
Right.
like it's just a man-made thing. And so that's why in the Orthodox Church, we kind of have certain parameters where we say, hey, these are the big borders that you have to stay within. But if you have a personal opinion on something maybe as interesting as this Pascha, tradition, what did Christ eat on the Passover? I mean, as far as I can tell, he probably fasted until he broke bread. Blood. We believe in the Eucharist was his body and blood. I mean, it's that is theological. That is something an Orthodox Christian has to believe. Um, I assume the God that made the heaven and the earth and everything that there is could also implant himself in bread and wine if he wanted to as well. But that's for another discussion. But anyway, if as an Orthodox Christian and you wrote a paper on how you believe that Christ, didn't partake of the lamb as a statement, that he was so anti animal sacrifice in an effort to restore himself to the original, like Adam, to show us a way to live better. I mean, before he left and was crucified. I mean, I don't think anyone would say that's terrible. But I guess I just would make sure that as we're eliminating industrial farming, that we're also elevating marriage, that we're also elevating going to church and being a family person and being Christ centered, and that in that entire ecosystem of the spiritual path, everything is synchronized in the right way. But it sounds like our next conversation will start out talking about this prayer and fasting verse, and then maybe a little bit more about whether or not Christ himself might have, as a statement, intentionally said, "Hey, we're not going to eat the lamb today." And honestly, if someone told me that Christ was a vegetarian his whole life, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that. Like I said, for me, as a person who's not a theologian, who's not Wesley Huff, studies the scriptures for the sake of, and all the fragments that there are, I I humbly accept that I'm just a part of an old tradition that claims in deed, in beauty, in architecture, in lifestyle, that we are trying to ossify ourselves in the way that allows us to still mimic what was passed on to us. And because those monks do what they do, I feel like what you have to share is very relevant and maybe for different reasons and a different priority, but is probably quite accurate.
Well, I can't wait to talk more about it. And yeah, we'll get into it on a future conversation, some of these deeper layers and talking about the possibilities and the text and the different variants and the top questions that would, you know, that one would ask around if Jesus killed or ate animals based on the Gospels and the Old Testament and everything. Because when you really ask that question with an open heart and you really want to look, which is what I've done, because again, remember, I came from the farthest away from this truth that I could have as a fisherman, hunter, and barbecue restaurant guy. It was the scripture in the text and fasting and opening my heart and really asking for wisdom that I was guided on this path to resistance. Like, I didn't really want to give up my lifestyle at the beginning of this, but I just couldn't deny it the more that I looked and the more that I read and the more that I understood, where I really felt, hey, if I want to just draw closer, this is a path I got to take. So I'm excited to talk more about that and really excited to meet you and hopefully go to Athos someday, maybe even Sinai, like I said, St. Catherine's. And I'll tell you, to your point about orthodoxy, it's the architecture and art is definitely on point. I think one of my favorite, if not my favorite art form, period, is Orthodox iconography. I mean, it's just unbelievably powerful to me. So.
Yeah. Well, it's such a funny thing that you have a Coptic Orthodox wife, and as I said, you're kind of exploring something that is the highest level of orthodoxy, which is asceticism in this way, shape, and form. And so, keep growing out that beard. Before you know it, you'll be wearing black and wearing gold crosses too. It's funny how every bird finally makes it back to its nest. I don't know what's going on there. But yeah, you seem to circle around a lot of things that are very orthodox, Cameron. So that's just great. Hey, thanks so much for your time. I'm so glad to have it. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Talk to you soon, brother.